Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely massive, an event with such devastating gravity that it literally shattered the old world order and violently birthed the modern era we live in today. We're talking, of course, about World War I. This wasn't just your standard conflict. It was a global earthquake that shook the planet from July 1914 all the way to November 1918. So we're going to dive into the data, the shifting maps, and those historical dominoes to figure out exactly how this whole thing happened. Let's get into it. To really wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of this war, we have to start with some pretty sobering lethal math. 39 million. That is the approximate number of casualties, both dead and wounded, that resulted from this conflict. That makes it the fifth deadliest war in recorded human history. And this staggering loss of life, well, it was the direct result of a terrifying mismatch. You had rapid, unchecked technological advancements in 20th century weaponry, things like machine guns, poison gas, heavy artillery, colliding head-on with stagnant 19th century military mobility and defensive tactics. It was a recipe for absolute disaster. And the scale of participation was just as unprecedented. Get this, 70 million military personnel were mobilized to fight. To put that into perspective, that includes roughly 60 million Europeans who were just pulled right out of their homes, their farms, and their factories to go serve on the front lines. So this wasn't just some war fought by professional armies in distant, far-off fields. No, this was what's known as Topyekun Savaş. Total war. Entire societies, economies, and industrial bases were completely swallowed up by the war machine. Section 1. Anatomy of a Global War. So, how did a conflict that was fundamentally based in Europe drag the entire planet into the trenches? Well, perspective shaped everything, right down to the very name of the war. For the Ottoman Empire, this was an existential struggle that touched literally every single household. They called it the Harbi Umumi, meaning the general war, or colloquially, the mobilization, because it was just everywhere. On the flip side, across the Atlantic, the United States press viewed the whole thing with a kind of detached neutrality. To them, at least until they officially entered the fight in 1917, it was simply the European War, just a distant conflict happening across an ocean. Okay, let's break down exactly who was fighting whom. On one side, we have the Entente powers anchored by the United Kingdom, the French Republic, and the Russian Empire. They were facing off against the Central Powers, which featured the German Empire and Austria-Hungary. But here's where it gets really interesting. Take the Kingdom of Italy, for example. Italy was originally part of this alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they used a pretty crucial loophole. Because Austria-Hungary went on the offensive, Italy flat out refused to attack. They stayed neutral at first, and then, in a massive geopolitical plot twist, they actually switched sides to join the Entente in 1915. Section 2. The Unexpected Spark in Sarajevo. All right, so we've seen the macro scale, the millions of soldiers, the massive alliances, but how did all of this actually detonate? Let's zoom in from that global perspective right down to a single, fateful day in June 1914 in the city of Sarajevo. This was the day that provided the unexpected spark that set the whole world on fire. Here's how the infamous July crisis played out step by step. Step 1. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Step 2. Austria-Hungary responds by sending Serbia a brutal 10-article ultimatum. It was designed specifically to violate Serbian sovereignty so heavily that they would have absolutely no choice but to reject it. Step 3. Great Britain desperately tries to call a European conference to solve the crisis diplomatically, but Germany and Austria-Hungary completely refuse to attend. Which leads us right to Step 4, the inevitable invasion of Serbia on July 28th. Section 3. The centuries-delayed European reckoning. Now, an assassination is a terrible tragedy, but it doesn't automatically trigger a global apocalypse unless the room is already filled with gasoline, right? So let's play detective for a minute and uncover the centuries-long political fuse that had been slowly burning across the continent. You see, this wasn't just a sudden explosion. It was a centuries-delayed European reckoning. There was this incredible domino effect that basically paved the way to war, tracing a geopolitical thread all the way from 1648 to 1870. Each of these massive historical events subtly shifted the balance of power, created some deep resentments, and locked nations into a super tense trajectory that was bound to crash in 1914. So the absolutely crucial starting point is way back in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. This essentially ended the devastating 30 Years' War by dissolving the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, why does a treaty from the 1600s matter for World War I? Because it kept the German states fragmented and weak for centuries, which totally delayed their unification, all while Britain and France were outbuilding these massive global empires. Interestingly enough, this very same treaty also laid the foundational concepts for the sovereign state system, and even the roots of the modern European Union we know today. Over the next century or so, Europe really tried to keep itself stable. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna established this fragile balance of power. Then, the Crimean War in the 1850s saw European nations actually uniting with the Ottoman Empire for the sole purpose of blocking Russian expansion. But the real earth-shatterer was the Battle of Sedan in 1870. This is when Germany and Italy finally unified into major nation-states, and they absolutely wanted their seat at the table. This completely broke that old balance of power, leading directly to imperialist foreign policies, massive polarization, and a deeply paranoid, tense era that became known as the Armed Peace. Section 4. Trenches and Deadlock. Those alliances that had been built up during that Armed Peace operated kind of like a series of tripwires. Once Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia, it was like a chain reaction. Russia mobilized to protect the Serbs, then Germany mobilized to protect Austria. France mobilized to protect Russia. Suddenly, you've got simultaneous invasions unfolding all across the continent. Germany's initial plan was to sweep rapidly through Belgium and Luxembourg to capture Paris, but that march stalled out. The conflicts on the Western Front devolved into a horribly stagnant trench war. Millions of men were literally dug into the mud, fighting brutal, endless battles over mere yards of territory from 1914 all the way to 1917. Now, this grim reality in the West was somewhat contrasted by the Eastern Front, where Russia actually had some early successes against Austria-Hungary, before eventually being fiercely pushed back by the German army. And this brilliantly illustrates how the war functioned almost like a black hole, just pulling the rest of the world right into it. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined in, opening up vital fronts in the Middle East. Italy and Bulgaria jumped into the fray by 1915, followed by Romania in 1916. But 1917, that was the real pivotal year. The Russian Empire collapsed from within due to the Bolshevik Revolution and withdrew from the war entirely. And just as Germany thought it might finally win, fresh United States forces flooded into the Western trenches in 1918. Exhausted and facing its own internal revolutions, Germany finally accepted the armistice on November 11, 1918. Section 5. The Fall of Empires and Aftermath. When the guns finally fell silent, the political reality of Europe had been fundamentally erased. The civilian upheaval was just catastrophic, and the map of Europe and the Middle East had to be completely redrawn from scratch. 4 massive, centuries-old empires vanished into the history books. While the German and Russian empires managed to survive as states, albeit with massive territorial losses, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires weren't so lucky. They were completely dismantled, shattered into numerous smaller, independent nation-states, forever altering the geopolitics of Central Europe and the Middle East. Out of this unprecedented trauma, there was a desperate, global desire to make absolutely sure this lethal math was never repeated. So, on January 10, 1920, the League of Nations was established. It was an international organization built purely on the optimistic hope of relying on diplomacy and collective security to prevent any future global conflicts of this staggering magnitude. But we have to end our explainer today by asking a deeply provocative question. Did the end of World War I actually bring peace, or was it just a 20-year pause? Because when you look closely at the harsh punishments of the Treaty of Versailles, the newly ignited surge of nationalism, and those massive power vacuums left by the fallen empires, it becomes chillingly clear the peace of 1918 didn't stop the fire. It simply planted the very seeds that would inevitably grow into World War II. Definitely something to think about as you look at the map of the world today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our present.